Hope you enjoy part two of North Korea Iran EMP threats.
To talk a little bit more about the specific threat that Peter has described and that the E.M.P. Commission considered sufficiently serious to recommend be addressed as a matter of utmost importance to the nation. From the South, we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Hank Cooper. Ambassador Cooper, among many other distinguished roles in our country's government, served as the director of the Strategic Defense Initiative under President George Herbert Walker Bush. He knows a lot about both missile threats and the state of our capabilities to both discern them and to correct them or counter them. He is, as they say, a rocket scientist. I'm very pleased to have him with us, Mr. Professor.
Thanks, Frank. I want to add just a point or two that to what Peter said. Lloyd's of London also, in reports I saw, indicated that this particular vessel earlier this year had made stops in Russia and in China. And in my mind, the whole incident points to what I refer to as a cacophony of proliferation. And while we focused on North Korea and Iran are colleagues cooperating on nuclear testing and on ballistic missiles, and they both launch satellites, have launched in the past year, satellites over the South Pole, which, if they were carrying a nuclear weapon, were at just about the right altitude to be detonated over the center of the United States and potentially knock out the entire electric grid. So in the case of North Korea, perhaps our historic approach to things might deter them. Some might argue that. But in the case of Iran, we know they're ideologically committed to not only the destruction of Israel, the little Satan, but also the United States, the great Satan. And there's serious question as to whether or not the leaders of Iran would back away, and I'm assuming others will talk more about Iran on the basis of being concerned about nuclear retaliation if they could kill, hundreds of millions of Americans, which is what is at stake with this EMP threat. Now, in the case of the threat from the South, there are two kinds of threats that I want to talk briefly about. You mentioned the E.M.P. Commission. Even earlier than that, there was a threat commission that Don Rumsfeld chaired in the late 90s, which noted that threat missiles could be launched off of our coast. And they could be launched over the United States, and we had no defense about it. I don't know why Don didn't do anything about this during his term as the Secretary of Defense, but he didn't. We're just as vulnerable today as we were in the late 90s and during the time of the E.M.P. Commission, except for a couple of possible alternatives that I want to talk a little bit more about. And the real hope, in my judgment, for doing anything in the near term lies with the Aegis missile defense system, ballistic missile defense system. As most of you, I assume, know, we now have deployed somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 or so ships, 16 I believe it is in the Pacific, and they're going to grow to a similar number by 2015 in the Atlantic. And they're at sea around the world, and notably a number of them are either in the ports or along the east coast of the United States, those in the Atlantic, which I've looked at recently. This is important because we now are aware that the single site in Alaska, while it provides some defense for those of us living on the East Coast, it's not terribly good against ICBMs over the East Coast. And those ships that are either in port or traveling on the East Coast could provide that defense if they get a cue from a radar up in our northeastern part of the United States, the ships that are currently deployed. And they've already been demonstrated to have a capability to intercept short, medium, intermediate range missiles, and they've also shot down a satellite, which is a point worth noting since one of the threats of concern is a satellite coming over the South Pole. The problems we have is there is no radar up in the northeastern part of the United States. What kind of radar would be required? Well, it's referred to as a TPY-2 radar. It's an X-band radar similar to what is deployed with our THAAD system, and it's like what will be deployed in Romania and Poland in 2015 and 2018, I guess it is, and operational by 2018. The defense systems that are currently on our ships today with that radar in Maine could defend the region between Washington and New York, for example. And what's on the ships would require an additional radar if it's to defend the southern part of the eastern seaboard, perhaps based in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. But none of these ships operate in the Gulf of Mexico, which is, in my mind, the soft underbelly of the country. So there is nothing there to provide any defense against launches from off of ships or from Venezuela or from Cuba if you want to fold them into the mix. And that's a problem that needs to be dealt with, could be dealt with precisely the same kind of defense the American taxpayer is building, paying to bill, programmed, funded, as far as I know, to have operational in Romania in 2015 and in Poland by 2018. And when the Poland site is operational, there will be a missile for the standard missile replacement on the ship, which will be more capable, and that missile, with a single radar in the Northeast, could defend the entire United States east of the Mississippi. If we spend the right kind of money on building a lightweight kill vehicle, you could defend the entire United States from ships off our coast. How possible is this? Many people say you can't do that because the Navy won't stand for picket ships. Last year, on an average day, if you go look through the data, we had 2 ships on the East Coast on an average day, and something between 3 and 6 ships either in port or in maintenance cycle. Those numbers will go up in the coming months because of the modernization cycle that's underway. With respect to looking south and getting an early cue, if you study the radar fans that are produced, and these pictures are out in the handouts, and thanks to Peter Busey, there are radar fans that were legacy of the Cold War warning systems we had for missiles that would come over the North Pole. And notably missing is a fan headed south. If you could put a radar in the Panama City, Florida area to fill that gap. It's hard to see because most of the rest of the picture is covered. That's not sufficient to provide the Aegis capability, but it is important to internet the radars around the world to provide early cueing information and track information to enable the defense. So if you put those things together, though, with the Aegis Ashore site at several military bases around the Gulf of Mexico, we could close this gap with respect to the missile threat. I think it's important, I want to say this, and I don't want to dwell on it because others will be dealing with it. Missile defense is not going to help you with the threat from the sun. And it's important to deal with the grid. And if we deal with the grid, that also is very important in dealing with the missile defense threat, because the threat of an EMP burst 200 miles up doesn't kill people on the ground. It turns out the lights. It turns out everything else, essentially, that we deal with. But if we're able to turn them on again, if the electric power grid can be restated, replaced, the transformers can survive this attack, then we can come back. We can survive. And so I'm very much in favor of the grid, the SHIELD Act. Missile defense is important, but it's not sufficient.